Opening the center to develop pieces and prepare for a kingside attack offers immediate dynamic possibilities. Establishing central presence and preparing for kingside activity. This knight maneuver immediately challenges white's pawn structure and opens options for dynamic play. Developing the knight to f3 prepares castling and supports a potential e4 push, eyeing central control. Establishing central presence immediately challenges white's pawn structure and opens lines for future piece activity. Unleashing the light-squared bishop, white immediately stakes a claim on central diagonals, aiming to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially create early attacking chances. Solidifying the center now allows for developing the bishop and preparing for c5, a common thematic break. Solidifying the center and preparing for a king's Indian attack setup, this move offers flexibility for piece development. Developing the bishop here actively contests the center and prepares to castle, a sensible step towards rapid king safety. Challenging black's central pawn by creating an outposted knight, forcing a decision on the bishop's activity. Securing the monarch within its fortress offers a vital shield, preparing for eventual central operations and freeing the rook for active duty. Rerouting the knight to a more flexible square, preparing to support a pawn push in the center or potentially swing over to the kingside, while simultaneously avoiding immediate confrontation with black's bishop on d6. Provoking a central pawn confrontation, black bravely injects dynamism into the game by challenging white's d4 pawn. This bold advance immediately questions white's knight on d2 and seeks to disrupt the pawn chain, potentially opening lines for black's bishops and rooks. Solidifying the center and preparing a queenside expansion, this move aims to create a stable pawn chain while preventing black's d5-d4 push and potentially opening a line for the c-pawn later. Shaping the central pawn structure for queenside counterplay, this declaration of intent seeks to untangle the pieces and potentially open lines towards white's kingside, a proactive step given the knight's recent redeployment. Establishing a solid central pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn breaks allows white to consolidate their position while keeping options open. Developing this knight to c6 now is a crucial step in solidifying black's central presence and preparing for potential pawn pushes like e5 or c4. It also increases pressure on white's d4 pawn, forcing white to remain vigilant about their central control. This piece placement not only increases mobility, but also contributes to a more harmonious defensive structure, ensuring the king remains well protected behind its pawn shield. Repositioning the knight from the edge of the board towards the center offers greater flexibility and prepares for potential pawn breaks, while simultaneously reinforcing the e5 square, which will be crucial for controlling central squares and supporting future attacking ideas. Breaking open the center with cx-d4, black challenges the pawn chain and seeks to activate the queen's bishop, potentially opening lines for an attack on the kingside. Opening the e-file now allows for immediate central pressure and a potential route for the rook, while simultaneously reinforcing the d4 pawn and creating a more solid pawn structure. The knight's vault to e4 strategically challenges white's central control, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and create outposts for further infiltration. Unleashing the bishop from its protected perch, this maneuver proactively contests the center and subtly prepares a potential queenside expansion. Unleashing the knight's potential by fixing the kingside pawn structure, this aggressive push not only seeks to dislodge white's prominent bishop, but also prepares for a more active piece play, potentially opening lines for black's rooks down the f-file if white reacts poorly. Sacrificing a knight for the queen's pawn structure creates significant pawn weaknesses for black, while also opening lines that can be exploited by white's rooks and queen, potentially leading to a king attack down the open f-file. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the b-file for your rook, a crucial pathway that can be exploited later, while simultaneously solidifying your central presence with doubled pawns, a positional trade-off offering both strengths and potential weaknesses to manage. White aims to activate the queen, eyeing the kingside and potentially supporting a central push later, while also preparing to castle queenside if the situation warrants a more aggressive stance. Activating the rook on the semi-open b-file immediately asserts pressure, aiming to exploit the pawn structure imbalance created by the capture on c6 and the subsequent bxc6. This proactive placement also prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queen side, aiming to gain space and create further complications for white's king. Unlocking the queenside rook's potential, white aims to challenge black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the open b-file. Shattering the symmetrical pawn structure creates a doubled g-pawn for white, fundamentally altering the king's defensive integrity and opening potential lines for black's active pieces. Opening the h-file immediately poses questions about king safety, but it's a calculated risk to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the bishop pair's long-term advantage. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside is a bold decision, aiming to dismantle white's pawn shield and exploit any lingering king vulnerability, though it potentially weakens your own king's safety and leaves the f-file more exposed. Unleashing a pawn thrust to seize the center and expand queenside space, white aims to dislodge black's knight from its active post and create lasting structural advantages. Initiating a pawn break in the center, 16e5 seeks to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, creating immediate central tension. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority, white initiates a potent spatial advance, aiming to constrict black's maneuvering capabilities and solidify control over key squares. Embracing the central pawn chain's pressure, black repositions the bishop, aiming to shore up the kingside and prepare for a potential queenside counterplay should white's central advance falter. Unlocking the central tension, this capture on e5 immediately forces a confrontation, potentially simplifying the position while opening lines for white's rooks. Seizing the open diagonal, the bishop reclaims its post, creating immediate threats against white's pawn chain and solidifying black's central presence while simultaneously challenging white's compromised queenside structure. Castling now shores up the king's position on the kingside, a prudent decision given the looming pawn chains and potential for open lines developing from white's queenside expansion. This developing thrust aims to dislodge white's bishop and activate the dark-squared bishop, but it might be a tad premature given white's solid pawn structure and king safety. Black's piece coordination on the queenside is still somewhat disjointed, and this aggression could expose weaknesses if white can counter with precise piece play and a strong central presence. The king on g8 remains a potential target if white can open lines. Unlocking the d-file's potential is now the paramount concern, as white actively pressures the now exposed black king following the material exchange and the creation of doubled pawns. Reactivating the rook along the f-file injects dynamism into the position, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop and pressure white's queenside pawn structure. A tactical redirection emerges, shifting the primary focus from the weakened kingside pawn structure to exploiting the open c-file and potentially creating threats against the queen. The queen retreats to a less active square, a consequence of white's aggressive pawn push that opened lines and now creates a spatial advantage. Initiating a bold central pawn push after consolidating the knights, this maneuver seeks to pry open lines towards black's potentially vulnerable king, while simultaneously creating space for white's own pieces to become more active, potentially leading to a favorable exchange or a tactical advantage. Relocating the rook to the fourth rank immediately pressures the white queen and aims to disrupt its defensive posture around the king. The knight's journey to b3 aims to solidify control over the central squares and prepare for potential advances on the queen side, while also offering a subtle threat to the bishop on e7 should it remain passive. A bold redeployment, the bishop now asserts a commanding presence on the light squares, directly challenging white's centralized knight and hinting at potential threats along the c5-g1 diagonal. Shifting the queen to the king's flank now aims to exploit the potentially vulnerable black king, creating tactical threats along the third rank and potentially opening lines for white's rooks if the pawn structure loosens further. Considering the board's current state, black's repositioning of the rook to the b8 square signifies a strategic reassessment, aiming to enhance piece coordination along the semi-open b-file and potentially prepare for future pawn advances or exchanges on that flank. Reclaiming the e-file and solidifying the central pawn structure provides white with a renewed presence in the fight for key squares. Recognizing the newly opened diagonal for the black bishop and the potential for counterplay against white's kingside pawns, black maneuvers the bishop to b4, directly challenging the white queen and initiating a tactical skirmish that could untangle the somewhat static position. Exploiting the pin piece, this aggressive maneuver forces the black king into a dangerous, exposed position, opening vital lines for white's rooks and queen to coordinate a decisive assault. Finally, black seizes the opportunity to regain material and simplify the position, addressing the immediate threat while simplifying the central struggle. Sacrificing the queen here is a calculated gamble to rip open black's defenses and expose their king, a bold attempt to turn a potentially passive position into a swift attack by leveraging the open lines and potentially trapped pieces. This retreat effectively aims to consolidate black's position, recognizing that the immediate tactical skirmish has subsided and a quieter, more strategic phase is emerging. By repositioning the queen, black seeks to defend the vulnerable pawns on the queen side and prepare for potential counterplay, perhaps by activating the rook on the b-file or bringing other pieces into more active squares. The goal is to weather white's current pressure and find opportunities to regroup, avoiding further material concessions or positional weaknesses. Unleashing a relentless queenside pressure, white's queen seizes control of the critical 7th rank, aiming to sever the connection between black's rook and its beleaguered king. Retrieving the bishop to its starting square seems like a defensive repositioning, but it simultaneously prepares to contest the crucial e-file that white has just occupied, potentially disrupting white's long-term intentions and creating a more fluid central battle. Targeting the isolated doubled pawns on the c-file after black's recent pawn sacrifice and forced piece exchange, this maneuver begins a calculated pressure campaign, aiming to exploit the weakened structure and potentially create attacking opportunities by opening lines towards the king. Challenging white's central grip and opening the rook's path, this maneuver seeks to activate the rook on its home file, aiming for active play and potentially a queenside counterattack. A daring knight maneuver, aiming to dislodge the well-placed bishop and create an outpost on d7, though it does leave the king somewhat exposed in the center for now. Shifting the queen to the 7th rank aims to disrupt white's rook on the e-file and potentially create counterplay against the weakened kingside structure, but it overlooks the immediate threat of white's knight on c5, which is poised to exploit the open diagonal and pressure the queen's escape squares. Relocating the knight to b3 aims to bolster the center, especially if black decides to advance their pawn on e5 or create pressure along the queenside files. It also prepares for potential tactical maneuvers or a repositioning towards the kingside should the opportunity arise. The bishop retreats to a more sheltered square, abandoning its outpost on the b4 square, which now becomes a tempting target for white's rook. Reinforcing the passed pawn's advance, this rook redistribution prepares to occupy the open column, potentially strangling black's coordination and exerting pressure along the 7th rank. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the queen side, b5 seeks to activate the piece from its passive defensive post and prepare for potential counterplay. Aimed at the king side, this queen repositioning threatens immediate havoc, leveraging the pin on the bishop and preparing a potential knight jump to a more dominant square. A bold attempt to regain initiative by activating the queen, but it risks overextension and leaving other pieces underdeveloped, potentially allowing white to solidify their dominant central control and exploit the open lines for a decisive attack. Unleashing the f-pawn injects dynamism into white's queenside pressure, aiming to pry open lines against black's beleaguered monarch and simultaneously threaten a central breakthrough, potentially opening the crucial e-file for the rook. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on the queen side, preparing to contest the open central files and potentially disrupt white's central pawn structure. Suddenly, a cascade of captures on the queen side unravels black's defenses, creating significant structural weaknesses and opening lines for white's remaining pieces to exploit. a desperate attempt to disrupt the opponent's charging monarch and perhaps regain some initiative. Relocating the king to the second rank opens escape routes and defends against immediate threats along the open lines. A fundamental shift in material balance now favors white considerably, as black's queen is about to be lost, simplifying the game into a potentially decisive material advantage for white. The rook landing on c6 decisively claims the open file, establishing dominance and preparing to pry open further lines towards the black king. Reactivating the bishop to the active g4 square establishes a crucial defensive outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. Proactively fortifying the queenside perimeter, white aims to contain black's bishop activity while establishing a more robust defensive structure against potential future threats on that wing. Black reclaims the e-file, aiming to activate the rook and challenge white's central dominance after the exchange of queens, potentially preparing for a more active endgame. Expanding the attack's reach along the queenside is the immediate goal, forcing black's pieces into a more cramped defensive posture. Sensing an opportunity, black aims to disrupt white's now dominant queenside pawn structure with this bishop sortie, hoping to exploit the slight awkwardness of the white rook and queen being somewhat tied down to defensive duties. Preserving the rook's activity on the now open file is paramount, preventing black from consolidating their pieces behind a more solid pawn structure. Reactivating the bishop to e3 opens up the dark squares for the queen and potentially creates tactical opportunities along the third rank. The knight's return to the fifth rank offers a welcome respite from its earlier wanderings, now poised to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn shield. The pawn push advances the attack on the kingside, aiming to unravel white's defenses and open lines for black's pieces. Expanding the queenside pawn chain bolsters white's presence and prepares for a potential pawn storm, aiming to cramp black's space and create weaknesses. A pivotal moment arises as black liberates their pawn structure, potentially unlocking new attacking avenues while simultaneously exposing their own king to the encroaching white pieces. Reopening the g-file, white aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and create opportunities for their remaining pieces. Sacrificing the bishop opens a direct path to the king and disrupts white's pawn structure, forcing a response. Consolidating the pawn structure after the exchange offers white a chance to organize their forces, albeit with a slightly passive position for the moment. Reestablishing a knight outpost on e3 offers a vital tempo gain, allowing black to regroup defensively while simultaneously probing white's newly formed pawn structure. The bishop repositions to a more active square, aiming to secure the g4 pawn and create potential threats along the dark squares of the kingside. The bishop scurries back, aiming to reinforce the besieged pawn structure after the pawn sacrifice. Securing the rook on the only open file provides essential support for the d-pawn's advance, creating a vital pawn majority in the center, and preparing for a potential breakthrough to regain material or simplify into a winning endgame structure. Unleashing the passed pawn down the d-file offers black dynamic counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's control and create winning chances in what is becoming a tactical race against the clock and the board. Seeking to exploit the exposed king and disrupt black's weakened pawn structure, the bishop slides into a checking position, forcing a decision and aiming to pry open lines for potential attack. The monarch seeks sanctuary on the kingside, a natural instinct but one that leaves it somewhat exposed to potential checks cascading from white's rook and bishop on the queenside and center, respectively. The knight maneuvers to a central outpost, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the queenside. Black's bishop seeks a more active diagonal, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially reposition for future complications or defenses. Opening up that queenside for your rook to cause havoc is a bold gambit, potentially creating a passed pawn, but also leaving your king a touch exposed to further pressure. Reclaiming the open files presents a crucial challenge now. The knight's presence on the queenside effectively pins down white's pawn structure, but the material imbalance on the kingside, with a rook and pawn versus a solitary knight, hints at an impending endgame where black might struggle to defend. A surprising retreat, sacrificing tempo to fortify the position and prevent black's rooks from exploiting the open c-file, while implicitly daring black to find a concrete follow-up. Pivoting the rook to the kingside aims to consolidate black's position and potentially launch a counterattack, seeking to escape the cramped space created by white's pawn chain and the active bishop. Breaking open the queenside pawn structure to gain an open file for the rook offers a dynamic path forward, potentially overwhelming black's centralized king. The rook makes its final advance, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially infiltrate the queenside if the bishop can find support. Fleeing the pinned bishop and embracing king's safety, white seeks refuge, albeit awkwardly, to untangle his pieces and prepare for the looming pawn storm on the queenside. The rook's sacrifice offers a tempting shortcut to capturing a pawn, but it leaves the black king exposed to a devastating discovered attack by the knight after the unavoidable recapture, potentially unraveling the entire position. Securing the monarch's escape route from the current dangerous diagonal is paramount, preventing potential mating nets from forming. A pawn push forward, seeking to create a new avenue for the king's escape or perhaps to tie down the white pieces with newfound space. Relocating the rook to the second rank offers a fresh defensive posture, seeking to secure the king from any immediate threats along the open files and squares, while simultaneously preparing to potentially contest the control of that vital file should the opportunity arise later. The bishop's aggressive foray creates immediate attacking pressure, forcing white to consider defending their king's safety rather than continuing their pawn-pushing advance. King relocation to the kingside offers protection and prepares for pawn advancement. Securing the rook on the 7th rank effectively eliminates any lingering counterplay from black's b-pawn and solidifies white's queenside advantage, forcing black to confront a stark material deficit in the ensuing endgame. Securing the outpost with the bishop transforms the board's complexion, promising a sustained material advantage and a path towards celebrating victory. Finally, the pawn structure begins to dissolve, opening lines for the remaining pieces and transforming the battlefield into a dynamic struggle for central influence. The pawn's advance to a6 fundamentally alters the pawn structure on the queenside, aiming to create an unstoppable passed pawn that will demand significant attention and resources from black to prevent its coronation. Finally consolidating pieces after a long pawn push, black aims to contest the open a file with the bishop. Initiating the final push, this promotion attempt capitalizes on the space created, aiming to transform a pawn into a decisive force and overwhelm black's diminished defenses. Black's bishop aims to solidify the central pawn chain and offer support to the looming pawn, creating a complex positional struggle where both sides must carefully manage their piece activity and pawn structures. Targeting the isolated queen pawn with the bishop repositions a key defender, aiming to exploit the structural weakness and potentially create passed pawns later on. The exchange of bishops frees up black's rook to potentially engage on the kingside, aiming to support any pawn advances that might emerge there, while white's king, though currently safe, must remain vigilant against any lingering threats or infiltration. Crowns are being forged as the rook promotion becomes inevitable, turning the tide of this protracted struggle into a decisive queen versus rook scenario. Conceding the bishop for the queen's pawn fundamentally alters the endgame landscape, leaving black with a passed pawn but a severely compromised queen's side structure, and white poised to activate their king. The king, no longer needing protection behind the pawns, bravely ventures out to hunt down the remaining opposition pieces. The promotion race intensifies as the newly crowned queen desperately seeks to disrupt white's pawn advancement, a clear attempt to create counterplay before the inevitable kingside checkmate. Advancing the pawn initiates a critical pawn race, aiming to create a passed pawn on the kingside before black can solidify their central control or activate their remaining pieces effectively. Unleashing a passed pawn towards the promotion square, black ignites endgame fireworks by forcing white's king into a precarious central position, aiming to exploit the weakened structure created by the prior exchanges. The pawn push advances aggressively, aiming to carve out space and potentially create a passed pawn further down the line, while simultaneously pinning the enemy king against the edge of the board. Suddenly, the promotion becomes a double-edged sword, offering a glimmer of hope for checkmate, but demanding careful consideration of the counterplay that arises. The king's escape route is finally clear, venturing out from its corner to hunt down the isolated pawn. The king's desperate scramble for safety is momentarily halted by this forcing check, aiming to disrupt white's imminent queen promotion and buy precious time. The king's journey to safety is perilous, and this move seeks to reposition it away from the central chaos, finding a more secure square on the king side. The black queen relentlessly pursues the white king, creating an unavoidable checkmate threat. The monarch inches closer to safety, preparing for the inevitable pawn endgame shuffle. Unleashing a final, desperate check, this move forces a pawn promotion, bringing the queen back onto the board and attempting to disrupt white's overwhelming material advantage in a whirlwind of complications. The white king retreats, seeking refuge on the g-file, a necessary repositioning after the queen's devastating maneuver. The unleashed pawn, finally finding its companion, has cornered the king in a fatal embrace.